Welcome back to Shades of Color with Ryan Rucker,
Claire Padula,
Sarah Hassan,
and Matthew Sevilla.
Today we will be discussing segregation and education and the various ways that these two avenues intersect and have impacted each other, specifically in Philadelphia. We have interviewed 13 residents of Philadelphia's historical Simpson House, a senior living community known for its diverse and culturally rich nature. This allowed us to make real-world connections between what we have learned in our class on Du Bois's Philadelphia and the experiences of others who have lived in Philadelphia.
Let's hear the voices of our interviewees, who we thank for their strong contributions to our oral history project, which you're listening to right now.
Can you tell us your race or ethnicity?
White Caucasian.
White.
I'm an Italian American.
Caucasian.
Caucasian.
I'm Northern German with 10% Polish.
I'm black. I'm all Negro. Old-fashioned. I'm all black. It's an African American.
African American, black race.
I am Caucasian.
Hey, the Du Bois experts have arrived. Our class on Du Bois's Philadelphia has immersed us in the physical, social, and political landscape of Philadelphia throughout the years. After reading and analyzing Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, which is regarded as one of the most significant sociological works to date, we are very confident in our knowledge of 19th century Philadelphia. Matt, to set the scenery for them, I think we should just kind of explain what education and segregation have meant for Philadelphia in the past. So according to the Philadelphia Negro, black schools were not founded until the 1822 Byrd School on 6th Street, and in 1850, the U.S. Census reported 3,498 adults who could not read nor write, out of a population of about 8,000, and there were about 2,176 children in school. What does this mean to you, Matt?
I think you can see a clear discrepancy in the amount of students that were given opportunities comparatively to white students at the time. And I think you can maybe expand more on that.
Totally. And in addition, black schools often had access to significantly less resources, which we already know. And as a result, they were often less efficient than the predominantly white schools. And I know that we learned about charity schools, which were founded pretty much to further education for children that come from disadvantaged or low income backgrounds. And these charity schools often had white teachers that staffed them. And, we're kind of trying to do justice to the black population and just kind of advance desegregation and just kind of evening out the education climate at the time.
Yeah, definitely. Teaching was one of the most impactful ways that white people could support the growth of black populations.
For sure. And there is a quote in the Philadelphia Negro that specifically stood out to me. Let me go to it. I thought that this quote was pretty powerful. It says, "Considering this testimony as a whole, it seems certain that the Negro problem in Philadelphia is no longer, in the main, a problem of sheer ignorance, but rather the problem of education is still large and pressing." And I think that this quote is very relevant to today's installment because it sort of perfectly bridges our two themes of education and segregation. I mean, we also know that Du Bois strongly favored education, especially when focusing on the black population or the African-American population. He believed that a well-educated African-American leadership class, which he called the talented 10th, would uplift the entire community. And this idea didn't necessarily mean that only elites deserved education, but rather that society needed highly educated teachers and professionals to challenge these racist structures and to encourage process. And I think that this emphasizes that education impacts segregation and racism because when African Americans were very educated, they were more likely to succeed at refuting the ideology behind segregation and racism. And I think that this is kind of why white people that were racist at the time did not want African Americans to be able to obtain sufficient education. They probably feared that this would mean that the African Americans would be more able to stand up for themselves and kind of just refute the ideology behind all of it.
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. Thank you for going over everything and giving us a great introduction to start talking about Simpson House. So yeah, let's dive into those interviews.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Simpson House,
Yeah. Okay. So first, I kind of want to talk about Theodore Irwin. Theodore Irwin lived in Philadelphia all his life. He worked as a public school teacher at William S. Pearson Middle School, and he also went to Cheyney University of Pennsylvania.
Wow.
And he's been living at Simpson House for about 4 years now.
Wow.
Okay, so in Irwin's interview, he talked a little bit about wanting to become a scientist, but really there's like kind of limited options for people of color, and this is what he had to. He spoke on that.
And the counselor asked me what it was I wanted to do after graduation. I said, well, I want to become a scientist. And she said, well, Mr. Irwin, you can't become a scientist. There are no Negro scientists. And I said, well, maybe I could become a science teacher. And she said, well, Mr. Irwin, there are no Negro science teachers in Philadelphia.
That kind of brings me to the second quote, which in his interview he talked about his experience with the lack of options for people of color, and so him not being able to, like you said, not being able to be a scientist or being told that there's no scientist, kind of falls through. Where apart from his interview, he says,
none of the Temple, LaSalle, and Penn, of course. None of those schools put a hand out for any of us at my high school. I attended Ben Franklin High School. And when I look back on it, I feel that they really weren't expecting much from us and did very little to promote our advancement. But we made it anyhow. And Cheyney was accepting. Cheyney accepted me.
thinking back on this quote, he said, doesn't it make sense to you that that's why they weren't given any of those those opportunities, Claire?
Yeah, limited education really kind of shows it, and it impacts them all throughout their life.
I agree.
And because of this limited model of what black students could be, it's almost like he became the model. When he became a teacher, we know that he taught in almost all black schools. And a quote that he said was
at William S. Pierce School. And I reflect on it. I became like a father. Because there were only one of two black males in a lot of the elementary schools, and that's the situation at at Pierce. And I realized that I became a father figure with the little girls who looked up to me, and the boys who looked up to me as a father, a surrogate father.
And I think that this is sort of a testament to the role of teachers in the school system.
Yeah, and also it shows a little bit of the importance of representation.
Yeah.
Through teachers and just all throughout the school, seeing opportunities and also seeing yourself and having a teacher of color as a student of color.
And I also think it resonates with us and all in a kind of way, because I bet you guys remember. You two guys remember when you had your first male teacher, if you ever did, and you know what I mean. I remember.
I know what you mean. Just being able to have that connection and kind of see yourself in someone.
Yeah,
totally. And also knowing that teachers play such a big role on people's future.
Yeah.
It's
sort of. Wait, sorry.
No, yeah, you go ahead.
It sort of reminds me of my interview with Mary Williams. Mary Williams was born in southern Indiana, but she eventually moved to Philadelphia with her husband. But in our interview, Mary is a white woman. She told me about her career in education, and she also taught in black schools. And she said,
I taught, I was never somebody to march and carry a sign. That was not who I was. Thank you. But I was involved in not desegregating schools, because I always taught in black schools. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't so much, we were desegregating the teachers. We were trying to have a good representation of blacks and whites in the teacher.
Yeah, and so I think this quote shows us that people are able to still get involved with activism, and they're able to do their part in the civil rights movement, and just Mary Williams was able to make an impact, and it wasn't directly like the conventional idea that we all have.
That's like, yeah, I think that's like kind of also, that's like similar to Theodore's experience as like, their role as a teacher is a form of activism as a people of color. Also, in your interview, Ryan, you talked to Mary Williams about her upbringing and her experience of segregation. So let's hear about that a little bit.
I grew up in a town where there were no black people. And it was what they call a sundown town. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, I've heard.
It was that kind of place. And for some reason, early on, that was abhorrent to me. And I'm not sure. Without understanding why, I sort of navigated toward black schools, black people. I don't know what that was about. And then when I met my husband, I was sort of open to the idea of a black boyfriend.
Yeah, and it was like, because Mary actually grew up in a sundown town where black people were condemned, and it was very frowned upon for like a white person to be in a relationship with a black person. And it's interesting to see how this dynamic sort of like almost had the opposite effect on Mary. Like she actually said that she gravitated more toward people of color. And she didn't really judge people by race. Like she gravitated toward black schools, and she just saw people for who they were as people rather than their race.
Yeah, and with Mary Williams and her background in southern Indiana, growing up in an area where there wasn't much diversity,
absolutely,
and like it was frowned upon, like you said, and that quote showed us, I think it can be seen like that followed with her when she was intentionally choosing a diverse community to be part of, and that's why she chose the Simpson House.
Yeah.
Do you guys also know who had a career in teaching and education? Joan Igler. Joan is an 89-year-old retired child welfare worker who has lived in Philadelphia for over 6 decades and was born in Brooklyn. She first worked as an elementary school teacher before moving to Pennsylvania, where she spent 35 years working in the city's Department of Human Services. She later spent over 2 decades testing doctors for U.S. certifications. She lives at Simpson House by herself, but she's an active member in the First United Methodist Church of Germantown, and she spends a lot of her time volunteering and spending time with her friends.
Yeah, I actually had the opportunity to read Igler's interview transcript, and I just feel like I learned so much about her life and her life experiences. She said,
I taught elementary school for 3 years in New York State, the first year, and then in New Jersey for 2 years.
And also, when she was asked about her interest in education, she actually said, quote,
there's not enough help for youth to have productive after-school activities and enough positive influences to keep them headed in the right direction. Right. We still have a dropout rate that's inaccessible. That's not okay. Mm-hmm. And they need a lot more work.
Joan Igler also shared some stories about race in education. Let's hear those.
All right, elementary school was in Brooklyn, New York. Mm-hmm. We had only a few people who were black, a couple of Puerto Ricans, and maybe 1 or 2 black kids in the class. Mm-hmm. That was 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. When I moved to Queens, we had a few black people in our class. My school had 2,500 kids. In our class, we only had 2 black people. We had twins, Larry and his sister. And we voted Larry as president of the class the whole 4 years. Mm. I don't really know about how that started, except that we were proud of it. Mm-hmm. That was an exception to policy. I'm sure that was not the usual thing that long ago.
So, like Igler's story, you can truly understand the noticeable gaps between black and white students, and also in some ways embracing their differences while reinforcing while others reinforced them.
Oh, yeah.
That's interesting. Eileen Harrison has a similar background in teaching and education. She's an 87-year-old white woman who grew up in Nebraska and New Jersey before she moved to Philadelphia at 18. She went to Drexel, and she studied in the home economics department and spent a lot of her time working at the Philadelphia public schools in early childhood programs and later as a directory and literacy educator. She worked in predominantly black educational settings and spent a lot of her time in the era of segregation and was shaping awareness about racial inequality in schools. During this, as an educator, she was really vital in the formative time for these kids and contributed to bettering the understanding of race and segregation. She actually said in a
Of it. I mean, if people had problems that related to race or inequities in their lives, I wasn't privy to them.
So yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and with her being a white woman teaching in these black schools, it's definitely important that she was open to their questions that they had about race and segregation and all that.
Yeah. This is like a reoccurring theme we've like kind of seen throughout all of their stories.
Yeah.
Is the intersection of like teacher and student and like the role that race plays in that.
That is very interesting. Another person at Simpson House who we had the honor of hearing from was Dr. Arlene Bennett, who grew up in West Philadelphia and actually was one of the first black women to graduate from med school and become a black female doctor. And she also worked as a psychiatrist. And she spoke about the lack of diversity in higher education, saying,
well, of course, the counselors, elementary school, junior high school, and even at girls' high, told me, you're a Negro, you come from a poor family, you're female, you'll never get into medical school.
Yeah, obviously, Dr. Arlene Bennett did eventually go to medical school, and I think her time at medical school, she was the only woman of color there. She spoke a little bit about that.
I do know we had 6 girls in my class. I was the only girl of color. And we did have one surgical professor who would come in, look right at us and say, "Good morning, gentlemen."
Wow.
That's the one of the few things that I remember.
Okay.
He would do that every day that we had a lecture with him. 6 girls in our class. Now the class is about 53% female.
wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think it also kind of shows the change over time. In the interview with Dr. Arlene Bennett, she also talked a little bit about Du Bois, which we learned about in our class. Let's hear what she had to say.
The other thing that was very interesting, he fought to have African American students attend college and have higher education, because the tendency, and I don't know whether maybe these counselors are part of the problem, they tended to want to take poor kids or kids of color, the minority kids, and push them into vocational programs. There's nothing wrong with the vocational program if that's what you want. But it is, I shudder to think of the number of boys and girls who were shunted into fields that they was bored and their full potential was never realized.
I think what Arlene is saying here is a real testament to like the lack of opportunity that was provided to students of color.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Moving on. Another person I actually personally interviewed was Herman Peppercorn.
Oh, I heard a lot about this one.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun on my interview. So Herman has worked in higher education for his entire career. First, he worked at the University of Illinois, and then eventually at the University of Munster and University of Munster, and also eventually at UPenn. He's actually from Germany.
Wow.
And he was a professor of geology. He immigrated from Germany after getting his graduate degree. He spent most of his career working at Penn, obviously. And we talked a little bit about the segregation that was present at Penn during his time teaching, and let's hear that from the interview.
The classes you taught at Penn, were they segregated, or were how mixed interracial?
Self-segregated.
What?
Self-segregated.
Yeah.
I mean, even my field, I do not know a black colleague in my field.
Wow. Is it because...
There are some, but not many.
So Penn's classes were never officially segregated, but like higher level education has always been like less accessible to people of color, and it is still today.
Especially when you get to more niche topics, I feel like that is especially relevant because, like, the deeper you go in a certain field, usually the more homogenous it becomes, and you see like less room for inclusion in all of these important things that you would want to see in a workforce.
Yeah. He also talked about addressing racism and the color line today, and his response I found it fascinating. We could just like play that right now.
What suggestions do you have for addressing racism and the color line today?
Education, education, education.
I think this is just interesting because while we're talking about the intersection of education and segregation, it really, people's education and their knowledge of the world and their exposure to other people, all of these things help reduce prejudice and make like the world more equitable, honestly.
Yeah. And it improves other people's educations as well.
Yeah.
We all benefit from hearing others' perspectives and different dialogues and all of that. And that honestly plays in because the person who I also had the pleasure of interviewing, Miss Rochelle Hammond, she went to nursing school, went to higher ed, and I just want to talk about that as well. But yeah, so she's been a resident at Simpson House for 6 years, almost 7, and she grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and moved to Philadelphia for nursing school. And so she's lived in Philadelphia for 50 years, and she ended up marrying an African-American man and having 2 mixed-race kids in Philadelphia. And so in our interview, we discussed her experience with individuals of different backgrounds and like how that drew her to moving to Philadelphia. And her quote here says,
"People more interesting than all the white people in Lancaster. We had a tiny community of people of color because Lancaster is really close to the South, Maryland. So we had a fair amount of people who came that far and thought Lancaster was a big city."
Wow. Yeah, that's
and
very
so,
interesting.
yeah, and it made me think that we've said this a lot, but really the area that a person grows up in can ultimately harm. The segregation can harm people, but there's a slight way that it can like draw people into wanting to
what they didn't have almost.
Yeah.
No, totally. And I going back to Miss Williams, that's kind of where I think our people kind of connect because they both had a similar storyline, being in a segregated area and then eventually going out to connect with people of color.
Yeah, and it's just like also coming to Philadelphia and showing just like how the diversity was embraced here and that kind of ultimate switch that they
something that we can like attribute to her interest in Philadelphia's rich, diverse culture, and I feel like that's kind of one of the big pros of the Simpson House. Her story shows the connection between segregation and early education and how that could affect someone, and in her case lead to her becoming more eager to be around people with people from all types of perspectives and backgrounds and things like that.
Yeah, segregation definitely had a lot of impacts on education, and it kind of brought me to the question about how the color line impacted access to education. Oscar Hankinson was a resident that Mindy had the pleasure of interviewing, and he actually gave some insight into this. He's a black man who's lived in Philadelphia all his life, and his parents moved to Philadelphia from the South during the Great Migration, and he attended Cheyney University, which is a HBCU. He also attended Temple and the University of Wisconsin for graduate school. Oscar attending an HBCU shows the extent of how the color line affected education for black people pre the civil rights movement. HBCUs are culturally enriching and provide great education, but were made as a result of segregation.
That's a good point.
He describes his experience with discrimination during the interview. Let's hear a clip.
At Cheyney, of course, I wasn't discriminating against. At Temple, I didn't feel as if I was discriminated against in getting a post-undergrad degree. And at Wisconsin, there was some discrimination, but it didn't affect me so much as I had my family to go back to.
Yeah, and so education can also combat segregation in a way. Like moving on, thinking about the intersection between those, as a person becomes more educated, hopefully they're less likely to fall into these prejudices. And so if they Phyllis Belk is an example of this. She's a 91-year-old white woman. She was born in Cairo, Texas, and has been living in Philadelphia since 1961. She's lived at Simpson House for 6 years, and in Texas, she worked as a journalist. And she reflects on her education and says this quote:
As I got into college, I became an activist. And it was while I was at the University of Texas that the Brown versus Education case was decided. And the year after I graduated was the first year that the University of Texas had a black student. And I did become sort of an activist while at the University of Texas.
Yeah, and Phyllis was exposed to segregation during her time at the University of Texas, during Brown versus the Board court case, and when UT admitted their first black student.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and that was definitely a pivotal time to be in school, to be in journalism.
Of course.
And her not falling into these prejudices at the time and being an activist for this and for equal education definitely has stood with her now, and she's contributed to the civil rights activism and to our community during such an impactful time.
Yeah, totally. Switching gears a bit, someone in our class also interviewed Mary Brown. Mary Brown is a black woman from South Carolina, but she has lived in Philadelphia for the past 82 years, so she can basically say she's from here at this point. So she worked for the government for part of her career and eventually worked for the Veterans Administration Insurance Division. Mary actually told us a little bit about her upbringing, saying,
I was born in the South, segregated South.
Yeah.
But I didn't have parents took care of us. We had our own churches, our own schools, our own hospitals, our own drugstores, our own everything, own schools. And we knew certain places you just didn't go.
Oh.
I wasn't allowed to go to the movies because you had to go up this back alley walk to get to the back of the movies to go, and my father said, you're not going.
Huh. Wow, yeah.
Now, maybe I felt a little deprived because when I go to school, the kids were talking about the movies. But after I got adult, I was so proud of my parents' protection. So it wasn't until I went to a larger place like Columbia that I went to the movies, because it was still segregated, but...
In this quote, she kind of talked about like the experience of her like being at school and like the segregation that happened there. And I think it shows like that while education was impacted, but also like connections and the social life you build at school can be harmed just by these divisions.
Totally agree.
This kind of just shows how dehumanizing the experience was and how, oppressed people really were during this time. It speaks to a lot of the negative impacts just socially of segregation. And Mary told us about the time that she spent in school and how it was greatly affected.
We know that we didn't have any school buses. The white people had school buses. We didn't. But we walked. And if it's a very bad weather, my father had a car, he took me. But I didn't feel that reputation of the segregated South. That
Mary then went on to do other things with her career, but I think this quote really speaks to how prejudice in education can be extremely harmful to those in the system.
Yeah, and it almost also connects to what Arlene Bennett was saying.
About lack of opportunity.
Exactly.
And the vocational schools. This is an example of Mary Brown as she was only offered to continue her career through a vocational school.
Exactly. I think it's really interesting to see all the ways that the stories kind of connect. There's that's why we have these central themes like segregation and education, because you can really see these structures in their story.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me to Carolina Nicosia. And she was born in South Philly and grew up in Delaware and has lived at the Simpson House for 10 years. And she had many different jobs during her career, and she retired in 2007 working in a lawyer's office.
Wow.
And so she gave us some insight into the effect of segregation and how that affected her early education.
I think part of the problem is that there was such segregation
that people in my kind of family group that grew up and went to school, it was like we were with white people. It never dawned on us that there was this whole other group of people and their experiences. Do you know, it's like two separate areas of growing up. Now, I remember when I was a child in Delaware County in first or second grade, there was one black girl that was in Prospect Park Public School, 1941-42. There was one black girl in my class. Now, in that case, I don't think there was any meanness towards that girl because I can't even remember. But I do know that the teacher put her in the last, like, far at the end of the row. But I can't remember anything. At that point, we were learning to write our name, and I mean that's first or second grade.
Yeah, and really understanding how formative early education is for people in their future, and how segregation at that time, like growing up, knowing that you're the only one and that people might hold prejudices against you.
Yeah, and I think it kind of just shows how segregation persisted in spaces that were even integrated often. You know, like in cases where there were black students in these schools, they still felt the social pressures of segregation. So it never truly like went away.
And we can even say that the effects of this can be like they linger, and you know.
Yeah.
To this day, there's disparities currently in different spaces because of the effects of segregation.
Yeah.
And so not only did it affect her classmates' early education, but affected so much more.
And I also think that, like, she talks about it a little bit here, the idea that, like, she was not exposed to other people. So, like, that in itself is, like, a breeding ground for prejudice.
Yeah.
To not be exposed to people different than yourself.
Exactly.
And I think
we're able to see it clearly.
Yeah, this is a good example of it. Another interview we looked at was Barbara Mitchell and Ruth Thornton. Barbara and Ruth are a married couple who have lived in Simpson South for 8 years. Barbara is from Philly and Ruth is from Fort Worth, Texas. Ruth moved to Philly after finishing her PhD in Louisiana and met Barbara during a National Organization for Women meeting. And Barbara also has a PhD from Penn. So, like, education is a big part of their lives.
Oh, yeah.
And something that they talked about in their interview was representation, and specifically in textbooks. Let's hear what they had to say.
I had been in a place working in the Peace Corps where there was extreme poverty.
Right.
But I did not know that kind of poverty existed in the United States. And I was in culture shock. Oh, and by the kids, they were using textbooks that was before World War II.
Oh, wow.
Pre-World War II textbooks.
That's really outdated.
In Philadelphia.
Wow.
And I was teaching reading, English, and history to the kids.
Oh, goodness.
And nothing in any textbook was black. Wow. Kids did not see themselves. Kids were reading, historic things that they were not included in. They were reading authors that they were not included in.
Yeah. So I think this quote is kind of just like a testament to the importance of representation, but also the difficulties that even integrated schools.
Yeah, because in these schools, there was still no representation. In the textbooks, the people of color couldn't see themselves in the history, and that in its own right is a problem.
Yeah, and it's something so small that people wouldn't have thought about as everything gets desegregated.
Exactly.
They're not going to think about, oh, now how are we going to make everything, because it's
more inclusive, but it's like that's even a problem to today.
Yeah, and we're facing the consequences of segregation to this day, because inclusivity, it follows through. We're not getting physically segregated, but when you're looking at something you're studying and you don't see anyone who looks like you, they brought up a really good point, because you're not going to feel inspired.
Another part of her experience that stood out to me was talking about underfunded schools and the lack of opportunities more so that come along with that. She spoke to the fact that, just not having funding really prohibits people from succeeding later in life, pursuing things like college. Professional aspirations were definitely really big to Barbara and Ruth. Through talking to them, they were both lifelong educators, and Barbara served in the Peace Corps and was actually an administrator at schools. So she definitely had a vested interest trying to make things more equitable for students at these school systems, even though they were underfunded, to hopefully have better career aspirations later on in life.
Barbara kind of highlighted in her interview, the shocking resource disparity that she found when she returned from the Peace Corps in 1964 to teach an all-black junior high school in Philadelphia.
And beyond the classroom, Barbara and Ruth spoke about their choice to live in Germantown, which is a predominantly black neighborhood, and the prejudice they faced from white peers because of this choice. And Ruth recalled a specific reaction from police officer friend, and when she announced that she was moving there, quote,
"And when I said I was moving to Germantown, he said, 'Oh, that's terrible. You shouldn't do that.' He said, 'I would never visit you there.'"
I really resonate with the story because I actually am from Germantown.
Oh, really?
And it still is a predominantly black neighborhood. But even when my parents told my grandparents that we were moving there, like as a white family, my grandmother had this very similar reaction. It's very interesting that that's still present today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Let's move on to Roberta Miller. So Roberta is a white woman originally from the Midwest who moved to Philadelphia in 1969 with a specific mission to teach in city schools. So she spent her career teaching English, I believe, and media studies at Simon Gratz High School in North PA, and in North Philadelphia, actually. And in the interview with Roberta, she provided a unique perspective on the idea of hidden segregation. So she actually explained that even in the integrated schools in Iowa, administrative systems work to separate students by race. And this kind of brings me back to what we were talking about earlier with how sometimes even though situations may have been more integrated, there would still be indentions from the segregation. So it never really went away again. And she said,
all of the black kids tended to be in one of the lowest. We were kind of grouped by homerooms.
Yeah.
And ability, or whatever they thought was ability.
And she noted that the systemic failure had drastic results. So when she was in school, by the time she graduated, the system had filtered out almost all of her black peers, which is crazy to think about. Quote,
by the time I graduated, so there was a whole maybe advisory and a half, which would be like about 40 kids that were black.
Yeah.
By the time I graduated, I think there was only one.
She kind of came to Philadelphia to teach, and she also talked about the reality of teaching in a high school compared to the suburbs, and specifically the lack of funding. Quote.
But I don't know. I like the challenge, and we were not overfunded. We were underfunded. Needed to scrounge sometimes for a book or for paper to run off a test or something.
Yeah, and so Roberta's story really shows as a counter-narrative of white flight because unlike her upbringing in a homogenous town with family members who held racist views and being in Iowa, Roberta made a deliberate choice to live in a racially mixed neighborhoods like Mount Airy and East Oak Lane, and she actively rejected the segregation that she was raised with.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think it's a common theme that we've seen in almost all the people at the Simpson House, and I think it is.
And now they've made this deliberate decision to come to Simpson's house.
Yeah.
And our last person, Bruce McNeil, actually talked about this a little bit. He's a 88-year-old graphic designer and a lifelong resident of Philadelphia. Growing up in the city, he witnessed the shifting demographics of neighborhoods and schools, so things becoming more integrated and more opportunities being given to previously marginalized youth. In the interview, he talked about a pivotal moment where he transitioned from an all-white elementary school to a junior high school that was 80% black, and he admitted his initial hesitation, but he quickly learned a lesson that redefined his outlook on race, and this quote speaks to that.
Bruce also played a personal role in integrating local youth organizations, and he shared a story from around 1951 when he was a Boy Scout leader for an all-white troop, and a young black boy named Marvin asked to join. And Bruce and the other leaders broke the color line in their organization, which is very remarkable to think about, and he still remembers the name of this. So that means definitely was impactful.
Yeah.
However, Bruce also noticed the darker side of Philadelphia's racial dynamics, white flight, and he recalled in his own neighbors reacted when black families began moving into North Philadelphia.
Yeah, Bruce's story really illustrates the two opposing forces at work in Philadelphia during the mid 20th century, like the personal connections formed in schools and scouts versus the systemic fear that drove housing segregation.
And that's all for the Shades of Color podcast. Thank you for listening in and spending part of your day with us.